Kat, as a thought leader and author who specializes in applied improv, storytelling, and facilitation, what is the art behind a good story? And why should people focus on becoming great storytellers?
I'm going to answer the second part of that question first. I think sometimes we think about storytelling as a separate, special form of communication on the side that only belongs to certain unique, rarefied people. And in fact, I think storytelling is a universal communication modality. It is the way our brains make sense of the world, which is to receive data and connect it into meaning. And that meaning making process is a storytelling process. The cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner says story is meaning, right? That they're the same thing. And so the reason I think people should think about consciously building their storytelling muscles, being able to craft narratives effectively and harvest and pick narratives is because we're telling stories all the time, whether we want to or not. And so if we can align sort of our intention and the story that we're telling with the story that our listener is hearing, there's all sorts of benefits to that in terms of building trust, empathy, creative problem solving, any kind of communication.
It's interesting because I like how you frame it that we think that storytelling is different form of communication. But if you truly think about it, we are story making machines. I mean, we like to make a story about everything. In fact, I've been going down this rabbit hole of identifying stories that my brain created when I was a kid, and just about an event I'd experienced, and then basically the story was created to help me understand. But that doesn't mean that those stories are true anymore. But even then, even at a very young age, our brains are just creating stories, but we don't even see that as a part of storytelling. But when it comes to that, as you said, which I completely agree with you, that's how we deliver a message. We rarely learn from facts or numbers or data. We just need to understand through a story because that's how our brain processes things. What do you think that are the biggest misconceptions people have about storytelling?
Yeah. Well, just leaping off of that, I think the biggest misconception people have is that it's something very complicated and something that you need to have a special talent for. The first part of your last question was, what is the art of storytelling? And I think the art of telling stories well comes down to a couple of things. The first is being clear about your intention with the story. I was about to say the moral of your story in professional settings when we're coaching leaders or working in organizations. It's a very specific, you're sort of starting with a moral or a key point you want to make and crafting your story in that way. Other times you may not know exactly what the point of your story is. But if you're doing it in any kind of situation where you want to influence people, then starting with the moral of your story is good. The second skill is having a clear structure so that the connections between what you're saying are have an arc to them with a beginning, middle, and end, right? Some definitions of story is it's a story if there's change over time. There's some kind of movement from one state to another, then it becomes a story. And being clear about the sort of cause and effect or what comes next and therefore what is another great storytelling skill. And then the third skill is the balance to that spine, if you will, or the narrative arc of the story, which is how do you elaborate or color or add detail that is evocative and memorable. Right? So how do you expand and describe an emotion or an image or a moment of change in a way that puts flesh on the bones of your narrative arc.
That's that's interesting. When you say that we should start with the moral of the story, just we starting with the end, with the message, and then almost like telling the audience, whoever, just a person that you're sharing a story with, or an entire room, just say you might want to pay attention to the story because this is the lesson that you're going to learn, and I'm going to show you how. Is that sort of what you meant by starting with the moral of the story?
Yeah, it's a really great to hear you feed that back because I want to be careful about what I'm not saying. There are, in some ways, I'm talking about applied storytelling, like storytelling as a tool for leadership or communication, uh, where you're crafting a narrative to help people understand a chart, right? Or to advocate for a change or to help understand something. And that kind of intentional storytelling for communication, the idea is to start in your own mind with what is my key message? What is it I want people to take away? What's the moral of the story? And then I can figure out what's the best example of that, or how do I want to craft my narrative so that it supports that moral. Now, there are plenty of storytellers in the entertainment field or in traditional um, spiritual practice, for example, or various cultures where they would say, you don't have to know the moral of your story, right? For example, Zen Buddhism is the opposite, right? Like in some ways they're like no meaning, don't drive the meaning. So in some ways it's about how are we looking to use our stories and what is our intention.
Interesting, and thank you for clarifying that. Now it makes sense to me what you were trying to say. Is that if we're going to tell a story, or if you want, or even I think most people would just say, "Hey, I have this message, or I have this moral, or just I need to let people know about this." But then, how do I do it efficiently and in a way that the message uh, gets gets received, understood, and it can persuade people. That's when you start incorporating aspects of storytelling in how you're going to craft that message.
Yes.
Seems like.
Yes.
Okay, so for when it comes to see, I was at a workshop a couple of weeks ago about podcasting, and one of the topics was storytelling. So I went there, and they were sharing how we need that if you want to share your story, how you share it, because I do believe that having the self doubt that most of us have of sharing our stories, whether all our setback things that we went through, we have that self doubt of sharing our stories. We feel that our story is not good enough or it's not dramatic enough, and I feel that that's one of the most selfish things that we can do, because we're basically not only denying ourselves a chance of having that breakthrough, but also we're denying the world the chance to benefit from our unique perspective or our stories or our talents or our gifts. So one of the things I was trying to figure out, I asked one of the panelists, but the answer was like, okay, it's not what I was looking for. When we're sharing our own stories, and this could be through a book, through a video, audio, whatever, I mean, and I'm gonna generalize quite a bit. You have most women will just go into very much details and all the pieces and aspects. We guys were just going to be very, very factual, and I think both extremes are not good ways to craft a story. So how do we find the balance to just craft the perfect story, or I wouldn't say perfect, but a great story that has the facts and the emotionals, some details but not too many. Finding that balance is quite difficult.
Yeah. There's so much in what you just said. That the last part, which is it's sort of in your question. You said, how do we balance sort of just the facts or just the what comes next forward action of our story with the detail, or right? And that's sort of what I was talking about when I was saying there's the sort of spine of your story and then the flesh on the bones of your story. I could tell you the story of Romeo and Juliet in 30 seconds, right? There are these two families that were feuding. The kids fell in love. They got secretly married. And then he, inadvertently caused the death of her cousin and his best friend because he was trying not to feud. And they were separated. And then in trying to fulfill this complicated plan to get back together, they both ended up dead, thinking the other was dead. Now, it's an interesting story in some ways. It's fascinating. There's action and things, but it's not going to last 500 years. What makes it last 500 years is Shakespeare's detail, right? The specificity, the beauty of his language, the dramatic excitement of, the flesh on the bones. On the other hand, if you just have all of that flowery language and detail, but there isn't that sort of dramatic action of the story, it also probably wouldn't last 500 years. So you made it gendered, right? And I think in some societies, in some ways, we do have this stereotype of women are better at color or sort of adding detail, and men tend to go straight for the just this happened, this happened, this happened. But regardless of whether it's gendered or not, there are people who, they're different muscles, and we have different habits and different preferences in the ways that we tell stories. And the art, as you're saying, is to find the right balance. And there isn't one right balance. It's not like it should be 40% action and 60% detail. But it's the right question to ask. In this moment, with this person, with this intention, how much am I moving the story forward? How efficient do I want to be? How much color or detail do I want to add? And what detail do I want to add? Right? So if I'm teaching a workshop on storytelling, I'm going to add a lot more color to what I just said to you than I am explaining the difference between detail and narrative advancement here.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, I mean, I tend to ask open-ended questions because I know that there's not a one specific answer because every story is different. But yeah, it's just becoming aware of that. And I think even more so than adding all the details or the facts, it's also knowing how to add the element of emotion. And I feel that a lot of people, at least this is my perception, and it's something that we tend to focus on the sadness of a story. That's where we put most of our attention when we share a story. Rarely we focus on other emotions. How can we get better for regular people that are not professionals at telling stories? How can we just tap into other emotions when we are creating or drafting a story?
Mm-hmm. I love that you're pointing to emotion as a sort of special quality of story. I think when we're humans and we're telling stories, especially personal stories, or when we're telling a story for entertainment, we go to movies, the emotional, the feeling, the internal life of our characters is very compelling to us as story listeners, right? We mirror. What story does is help the listener and the communicator sort of mirror, the mirror neurons connect if I'm understanding your story and we're resonating together. And so if the story has rich, evocative emotion in it, that will activate those emotions in me, hopefully, right? And so we're building empathy and understanding and engagement and buy-in. I heard that in my framework of narrative action and color, emotion is one kind of color, sort of one place you can extend your story, right? In Romeo and Juliet, there are these beautiful soliloquies where she's expressing a feeling, he's expressing a feeling. And they're like songs, right? In a musical, right? The extending and heightening of emotion. So I heard a couple things you said. One was, we tend to focus on sadness. And I would say some people are comfortable with sadness, right? Other people are comfortable with happiness. Some people are comfortable with anger, right? We do tend to, just like a painter, there are colors that we are more comfortable with or that we use more habitually than other colors in our painting. And I think the same can be true in story. So a place to start, this is Cornelia, she likes to be involved. A place to start is to say, what was my experience? If I'm sharing a personal story, to start to identify what was my experience, what was I feeling in any given moment, and very specifically, what's a moment of change or transformation. A few minutes ago, I said the definition of story can be, some people say, is change over time, an expression of change over time. So what is the difference between how I was feeling at the beginning of a story and how I was feeling at the end of a story? And then how do I color or describe those emotions? So one of the ways is to just simply say, here's how I was feeling. Another is to describe what was happening in your body. Another is to describe what your inner thoughts were at any given moment, right? So I'm trying to think of an example. I just told a story for WGABH Boston for their Stories from the Stage series, and I was telling a story about my mother. And at the beginning, I'm talking about sort of how I resented my mother and I was sort of annoyed at her. And then in the middle of the story, I have a revelation and I feel sort of shocked, right? And so at one point, I was saying something like, I felt the floor fall beneath my feet, which is one way to say it. Other times, I'm just like, I hated her, or this is what I said, or this is what I did to avoid her. There's lots of ways to show emotion, not just tell it. And then by the end, at another place I'm feeling shocked, at another place I'm feeling sort of guilty, and finally I'm feeling really connected and in love. And that emotion mapping, if you will, is actually the narrative structure of the story, how I moved from one assumption or feeling about my mother to another assumption or feeling about my mother. I said a lot there. What made
No,
sense or didn't make sense?
no, it totally makes sense, and I definitely understood your point. I can see how the emotion mapping, and it is true. Again, I tend to. That's why I like to say it is my perception. Is true that you have people that are more inclined to be into other emotions, maybe anger or happiness or hopelessness or any of these other emotions. And I guess to me, I felt that, at least from my point of view and on a personal level, I know that the way that stories can last, so the stories can impact, if they can only impact or last, at least in my head, if you create that emotion in the person who's listening to the story. And since it is hard for me to tap into the happy or positive emotions within myself, it is far easier to just create a story around hopeless times or about sadness, around frustration, because those, since we tend to be inclined to have negative thoughts and emotions. It's just how our brain works to keep us safe. Our brains are not designed to keep us to make us happy. Our brains are designed to keep us safe. So it's easier to use that. But I feel that I would I would love to learn how to tap into more positive and create that beautiful mix and balance when you have moments of triumph and moments of dread or moments of everything is hopeful, and then you have a point that, hey, things are trying for the better, and then they turn, and then they take a turn, and then it's all sadness or frustrations. Those kind of things, at least I feel that those are the most powerful stories. Because even if you say it Romeo and Juliet, you basically have that. You have a mixture of is the love, how they like each other, how frustrating it was for them trying to get together because both families hated each other, and then at the end, the deep sadness of, man, these two young kids who love each other end up dying for the other person, and it's like ends in a low point, a negative emotion, but that's what makes it powerful. But if the entire story was just negative, I don't think that will resonate as much with people, because I think that we need that sort of, balance.
Yeah, it makes me think of music. A minute ago I said, in a musical, the songs are sort of the extended emotion. The same is true in a story, right? That you want to have the sort of cadence of a song. If it's all just the same, Philip Glass plays one note for 10 minutes and he gets away with it. But for most hit songs, right, you need to have a melody, you need to have changes of tempo, you need to have, right? You want to have different, movement. And so that's what I hear you saying. I think there are two levels of it. One is um, harvesting or identifying stories that have different sort of core feelings, evoke different things in them. So if you're feeling like, I wish I had more happy stories or stories with happier emotions in them, then the first place to start is to start to look for and capture those moments. And we're talking about personal storytelling now, is what I really hear you wanting to talk about. Um, so there are a couple of ways to do that. One is a great storyteller and storytelling teacher, Matthew Dix, has an exercise that he calls um, homework for life. And the assignment is every day, write down for yourself the most story worthy moment of your day. So we're only about halfway through the day right now, but if I had to pick one today, it might be that I have my friend has a big workshop that she has to do, and her husband just got COVID, and now she's not sure she's going to be able to do it. And in a sort of momentary impulse, I said, I'll fly to Chicago and do it for you tomorrow if you need me to. And I booked a ticket to Chicago sort of on the fly. Now, I don't know if that's probably not going to have to happen, but it may not ever turn into a great story that I would tell on a stage or in front of an organization. But for today, that's my most story-worthy moment. So if I asked you, what would you say is like a moment that might be a story?
Of today,
Yeah.
huh? Um, Honestly, probably just talking to you and learning about this,
Yeah.
and so basically, hold on. So you're trying. So the exercise is to create a stories bank.
Exactly. And you
Okay.
don't even have to make the story. And maybe 28 out of 30 days, you're not going to have story moments that are going to end up being crafted into bigger stories. But you get in the habit of you're training your brain to look for what is a story worthy moment, which is really a moment of insight, transformation, being affected somehow. And that change can just be like, I was happy, and then the coffee maker, I was making the coffee and I broke the coffee pot and it shattered. And I'm like, you can't take anything for granted in this world, right? I don't even know, I don't have to know the moral, I don't have to know anything, but that moment is sticking with me. If 1 out of 30 of those is juicy for you, you'll have a story every month that you could use in some way or share in some. And it also just trains your brain to think like a storyteller. So that's the first thing. The second activity is an activity that I think comes from The Moth. If you know The Moth, it's a personal storytelling show. They're done, I think, all over the world now. They have it's set up like a competition, but really it's just people sharing personal stories. And I think it's the founder of The Moth who came up with this rubric, which is put down an idea or a word or a location. It could be library or kitchen. In your case, if you want to come up with more personal, happier stories, maybe put joy. right? Or relaxation or delight. And then you build yourself a little grid where the top, so you can put whatever you want, topics. And then at the top, you put best, worst, first, last, and see if you can fill in those boxes. So, what was the best time I ever felt joy? Like, for me, it might be like there's a moment of joy that I remember. I was in the hospital. I had something called myelitis, which is it's like Guillain-Barré, and it paralyzes you. Your antibodies attack the myelin, which is the lining of your spine. And so I'm in the hospital, and sort of shockingly, all of a sudden, I can't walk. You recover. I'm fine now. But I had an IV in my arm, and I had it in for about a week. I was moved from the ICU to the medical floor, whatever. They didn't change the IV. And finally, after like 10 days, they took the IV out of my arm. And I have never felt such pure joy in my life as just the IV sort of being free of the IV, which had been in my arm so long. Right? So that's when I just thought, what's the best moment of joy I've ever had? It was that. It's just what came to mind right now. What was the worst moment? Maybe that's also the worst moment of joy I ever had. I don't know, right? Or the worst moment of joy I might say when my daughter was born, I had a C-section, and my father died the night before. So it was like the worst. It was the best joy, but also the worst joy because it was so complicated. I don't know. What was the first time I can ever remember feeling joy? Maybe it was when I was 2 years old, walking with my dad, holding his hand. It was the most recent joy I can remember feeling. Maybe it was when I met you and we came here and we started talking. So that's the activity, right? I don't know. How does that land?
I know. I love it. Honestly, I love it because you're basically building and exercising that muscle that we all have, but we rarely use. And to me, I've always been fascinated, and I'm not saying that those people do this. Well, maybe they do. I have no idea. You always have that one friend that tells the best stories. Always has a story. Always, and and you think it's like, man, their lives are awesome. I mean, they always have, whether it's like a funny stories, sad stories, any kind of stories, and then it's like, then you start questioning yourself, like, well, maybe my life is boring. No, I think we all have stories, but since we feel part of it that are not worth sharing, we don't even pay attention to what happens to us. We are just on autopilot in our life, just doing stuff, and then without, unless it's something very dramatic, unless it's like the death of a loved one, a divorce, a a medical emergency, or a promotion, or something that only when you have that huge spike in emotion, whether it's positive or negative, that's when we register as sad story, but not any other stories. Even when you go out with friends and you had a great time and somebody was sharing some insights, that's a story, but we never think about those.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on. Yeah, no, I think that's really insightful, and you've put your finger right on it. I just mentioned The Moth. There are lots of storytelling shows around. I mentioned Stories from the Stage. If you start to listen to those, what what you'll notice is there are plenty of people who participate in those shows who have big stories, right? Near death experiences, love lost or one. And there's also a lot of those stories that are very small, that are, uh, I woke up this morning and I had a revelation about whatever, or I was sitting on the bus and I saw some stranger across and it reminded me of what, either really internal or just very, very small. And sometimes the smallest stories can be the most powerful and the most resonant. I, you reminded me of two examples, sort of mirror examples. I've been doing some work over the years with Paralympic athletes, and so if for folks who may not recognize the term exactly, Paralympic athletes are the Paralympic Games are the elite games for excellent athletes with physical disabilities or visual impairment. So they happen right after the Olympics every 4 years. And these are, super excellent athletes with these who have these disabilities. And I was brought in years ago to help coach them on their stories. And what was immediately clear to them, and that they were helping us understand, was that they all had a big story, right? I was an athlete. I was in some terrible accident. My leg was amputated. I worked, struggled, and eventually I succeeded and went to the Paralympics, and now I have a gold medal. But there was a way that and everybody's like, oh, you're so inspiring. But that level of story in some ways became generic. It became predictable. It became the same for everyone. A detail here or there was different, but it was sort of a predictable story. And what we started to work on was, what is your even more personal, specific story? You all have hundreds of them. And I won't tell the whole thing right now, but an athlete named Sam Kavanaugh came up with a story which all took place in his living room. And it was about, he'd had his leg amputated and he'd been sitting around for months, and his wife pulled out his stationary bike and made him get on it. And he was very depressed because he could only pedal for a couple of minutes. And she was like, so how did that go? Aren't you proud of yourself? And he said, proud of myself. I could only do 2 minutes on the bike. I used to be this amazing athlete. And she said to him, yeah, well, how many minutes did you do yesterday? And that became his sort of mantra, was celebrate the 2 minutes. And it's what he goes around and tells people. That's a much smaller story, right? One moment in his living room. It was about his own mind shift and his wife, doing this small action of having him do his first physical exercise after his amputation. But it was much more emotional, much more powerful, much more memorable than the big story.
I can definitely see that, because when you're giving that explanation and when you're sharing that story, sure. I mean, we love to hear in those hero stories, how you went from a tragic accident or something until become extremely successful, or from rags to riches. Sure, I mean, those are inspiring by themselves, but they're not very relatable. That one is being on the bike. There are so many people who have felt ashamed of themselves for not being able to do something, for not being able to overcome something, for even trying to go on a walk. Somebody who is overweight or somebody who's struggling just to learn something new, and then they feel so frustrated. And I think those, as you said, those smaller stories tend to be more powerful because more people can relate to them.
Exactly. And when we recognize that relatability is one of the things that makes a great story, then it opens us up to, oh, well, I have so many stories that I can tell if I'm just trying to be relatable, as opposed to being heroic. I said I thought of 2 stories, and the other story was, I was just very recently talking to a different disabled athlete, and she was saying, everybody keeps coming to me and wanting me to speak, and I don't feel like I have a story. Like, I don't, like, I was born with this disease, and okay, and I had a lot of surgeries, and then I was, then I lost my leg. But really, that's not what I struggle with in life. Like, there wasn't a struggle there. I just did it because I had to. I'm a mom trying to raise 2 kids, or I'm just trying to go to the gym and have people leave me alone without interrupting me to tell me how inspiring I am. Like, those are the things that I struggle with. And I was like, well, those are stories, right? Like, tell that story. Tell the story of how your disability is a non-issue for you. And here's what you're really struggling with.
That is fascinating and interesting, and it ties to a point that I've been kind of thinking about a lot. How, sure, I mean, some people have setbacks, some people have disabilities, as you said. And what I like about the last story is that woman never let, well, I don't know if never, but at least at this point in her life, didn't let her disability define her. And I feel that with all of these stories, and that's why we try to do certain things, we let our setbacks, our challenges to define who we are. And it's all about that, almost to a point that, again, since our brains create a lot of stories, almost like I cannot do X, Y, and Z because I had this or because I had that. It's almost like we attach our identity to one particular event that happened into our life. So I really enjoyed listening to that story of that athlete, because she's like, hey, people think that my identity is attached to my disability, but it's not. It's the regular thing that I need to do on a daily basis, like raising two kids, trying to go to the gym at peace and just do my exercise like everyone else is doing without being bothered. Those kind of things are, I'm hoping that more people think about those, that whatever challenge, and that was a kind of like a tangent I went on, that whatever challenge you have faced in your life doesn't need to define who you are and what you're capable of. I don't know, just a thought I had.
No,
But
I think it's great. You started by saying that there was a story from your childhood that you felt like it was part of your identity, and then you sort of moved past it, or you've reframed it, or you've held it differently. There's a whole field of
yeah.
narrative psychology, which is in essence that, right? And I think good
Mm,
therapists in general do this for us. Like, what are the
mm,
stories we're making up about ourselves, about our lives, about the world, that are maybe need to be re-examined? They're not as helpful as they could be. They're not as true as they used to be, whatever true means. And so I love what you're saying about, I mean, I sometimes I get extreme and I say, we don't, I like to really push back against any kind of personality typing test, right? Where like, you're an ENFP, or you're a D, or whatever it is, you're a red. Because I think, again, those are stories and they make us smaller, they box us in. And in fact, our identities are the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories other people tell about us. And the more we can harvest a broad range of, be, as you were saying, more open and aware of what's happening and our environment and our habitual stories and our fresh stories and discovering stories and sharing stories, the more we can expand our own capacity as humans.
yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. That is one of the issues I've been having, and I don't know how to even share this message, because I hear a lot of people, on a daily basis, or even when you go on the comments on Instagram posts or even on Twitter, people say, "Well, I have ADHD, or I have this, or I have that, or I have." So if you keep telling yourself that, sure. I mean, I've been going through to a counselor since I was like 7, 8, because I had ADHD. You'll never hear me say that I had cancer when I was 13. You'll never see. In fact, very, very, very few people know about it. I guess now more, but very few people know about this, because to me, yeah, that's something that happened to me. But if I attach that story to my identity, what makes me great, then I'm always going to be that person who had ADHD or had depression or just had cancer or whatnot. It's like you, and then you're as you say, you're boxing yourself in such a confined place that you cannot grow, and then it's kind of sad, honestly.
It sounds to me like, hmm, there are certain stories that have weight to them in the listener's mind, right? So you say the word cancer, and as a listener, my guess is you're used to people already having a whole sort of download of stories in their brain. Um, and so it sounds like it's a story you've avoided because it's so big and powerful that it can overwhelm all the other stories that are true about you in your mind, or you're worried in other people's minds that that will define you somehow. Right? My guess is you have more than one cancer story. You probably have 100 stories of the times that were when you had cancer and what you went through and how that went. And looking back on it, you probably have a story about it today. You probably have the story of when you found out, a story of going through treatment. I don't know. You probably have many, many cancer stories. It's I think it's fascinating for us to look at what are the stories that I cling to as part of my identity? What are the stories that I avoid because I don't want them to be part of my identity? How am I telling my stories? How do I want my story to be received and it's received differently? Am I using I have ADHD? Like, what do I think that means? How am I telling that story? How do I have it fed back to me when I say it? There's just a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, no, I mean it makes a ton of sense. And as you said, now when you mentioned that I had probably hundreds of stories of my time when I was dealing with that, I was like, actually, I can think about a couples. Yeah, true, and it goes back to the point that we take a, well, at least me, take a lot of events for granted. Where I could create a story how when I find out how was the first treatment, how was within school, how was every time that I had to go there, how was all the blood transfusions and the radiation and chemotherapy. Oh, I can tell different stories of, and we can, I guess, we can break down a big story into several small ones that we can just share and add rela- relatability to things that other people are experiencing without having to just dump like a huge massive story or like a huge thing, and make it more digestible and more relatable to the listener.
Yeah. I mean, the story, yes, exactly right. And when we're working with leaders or organizations or talking about story as a meaning making tool in that context, we talk about three levels of story. One is an anecdote, and that's usually what people think about when they talk about a sort of self-contained, small beginning, middle, and end example, or right. So I'm not appropriating your life, but someone like you who had cancer at 13, maybe there's a story of how you were sick on a day and you missed like the school dance, or you weren't present for something that you wanted to be present for. And what was that like? Right? It's not really about cancer at all. It just lives in that world as an anecdote of one of the ways that it was hard. Um, there's also the narrative arc of meaning of any message that we're giving. So you have an anecdote, then you have this sort of message arc, which is also a story, right? So in an organization, it might be we've had this um, approach to our products and sales are down this quarter, so we're making this shift to a new way, to a new set of products, and next quarter we expect to be a successful company again, right? So we failed, we're making this change, here's going to be the great solution that we're going to have. And within that, you might have various anecdotes at various parts of the story, but there's the narrative arc. And then the third level of storytelling is this sort of ambient narrative, which is the meaning that we're all swimming in all of the time that our story might be pushing against or aligned with. So there are all sorts of ambient narratives about cancer, right? Like, oh, as you're like, I heard in what you were saying, like maybe if you have cancer, you're just going to suffer and it's going to be terrible and nothing good will ever happen in your life. Or you're a hero because you survived cancer, or you must have fought, you have to fight really hard against cancer, or whatever the ambient narratives are that live around us. We need to recognize and take into account when we're choosing our message and our anecdotes so that we can connect with people through what they already believe and the stories that they're already making up.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it definitely. I don't know if it sounds more complicated than it actually is. Just to use again either personal story, or if you're a leader of a company and then you're trying to hide the broccoli and then you hide it through a story, right? Just like, okay, I know I'm gonna deliver some bad news, so I need to see how I just hide it. I mean, how to hide it and still deliver the message, still deliver the bad news, but through a story that is actually, you know what, okay, we get it, right? So, which I guess that's why you are one of those people who believe, and I think it's true, that storytelling is so important for leaders, from a leadership standpoint, from a business standpoint, and I don't think that is talked about enough.
Uh, when we recognize that we are swimming in stories all the time, that the way we communicate is that we tell stories. If I just present a graph to you of data, I may not be, quote, telling a story, but you're going to make up a story, right? If you're going to interpret this data, your interpretation is a story. So if I'm leading you or I want to influence you in any way, right, I am going to be more effective at doing that if I am consciously clear about what is the story I want you to be telling here and how do I guide you to that story. Now, I don't always want to do that. Sometimes maybe I want to hear your story. Maybe I want you, to solicit stories from other people. I'm not saying that as the leader, have to always be the storyteller, but story is happening, and it can be used for good or it can be used for evil. A lot of what's going on in our world right now is we call it propaganda, right? It's taking, bastardizing facts, right? Throwing out what we call disinformation. That's really just storytelling, right? Whether it's real facts or not real facts, you're crafting the narrative to have people believe something or be influenced in a certain way. Those of us who don't like those stories or those, call them whatever you want, lies, disinformation, propaganda, we're not going to fight that unless we have more powerful, more robust, more memorable, richer, better stories. And I'll also say it's hard because lies are easier than truth, right? Lies are simpler stories because you can craft it in a much more sort of honed way than if you're really trying to be true. There's more nuance there. But it's very important, right? How do we cut through and combat these narratives?
Kat, you said something very fascinating that I never thought about until now. When you gave the example of, if I have a chart and then I'm just sharing the data without really going into details, you or whoever's listening to that will create a story in their head. So if you are a leader or whoever, if you're just showing facts and you're not sharing a story, you're taking the risk of the other person developing a story based on their own lens, how they see the world. And then there's a big room of that it could be a misunderstanding, and negative outcomes can come from the fact that you didn't take the time to develop a story, and then you're relying on other people to see the world just as you see it, which nobody sees the world with the same lens. So I think that pinpoints exactly why storytelling is so important, um, across many different areas of our life, and how the media, with, call it, as you said, lies, misinformation, propaganda, they're not giving the society a chance to develop a story in their head. They're already feeding a story.
That's right. Well, what you said is, I think that's very important too. So storytelling is important. If I have a clear message as a leader, or I'm explaining something that I'm an expert in, right, that I want to, story sharing is also really important. Story listening as a storyteller, listening for story is also really important. So really great leaders know how to, when they're communicate in a way that is memorable and resonant and sticky. They also know how to solicit and listen for story and insight. So maybe as a leader, I'm saying, these are our numbers this quarter. What do you make of this? Let me hear your interpretation, your story. And great leaders are able to hear many, many, many different stories and then integrate right? And sort of create even more nuanced and bigger stories. I think that's part of the job of a leader, is to listen. What are the ambient narratives and assumptions we're making? What do we need to have to fight against? What voices need to be amplified that we may not listen to as much? Um, and then how do I share back?
Yeah, I mean, I like, once again, I love that approach. I love that insight and how important this is, and that's why to me, I just want to learn more. And there's a TEDx talk. I don't know how this one is, where the speaker is sharing a story of how they did an experiment. They bought, I don't know, like 20 items or 35 items or whatever on eBay for $5 or less, and they hire writers to write a story about one specific item, and then they try to put it on sale, and they make so much more money for items that they pay literally nothing, because people were buying the story, were not buying the item.
Yeah, it's why TikTok Shop, or whatever, name your social media, is such an effective selling tool. It's why influencers, right? They're called influencers, um, are so much, or have so much power in our society right now, because they are literally telling the story, right? Like, I get hooked on this person and I get to know them and they're sharing their day, and then all of a sudden this makeup or this shirt or this, you know potato thing is embedded with meaning and connection in a way that it just wouldn't be if I just saw it on the side of the road. Or
Kat, I've been enjoying the conversation a lot, and I could go for even longer. But as a closing question, what lesson have you learned from your lowest point, or one of your lowest point, and is there anything about it you're grateful for?
yeah, I'm always grateful for every experience I have, because I feel like it stretches my capacity to empathize with other people, and it stretches my depth of understanding of the world and myself. Um, I referenced that I had this I had myelitis when I was in my early 20s, and um, I don't know if it was the hardest time in my life or not, but I do know that there was something about having everything stripped away, and there was this moment where I was like, oh, all I need to do right now is learn how to walk again. And I really, if I'm being honest, what I felt in that moment was relief, because life had sort of felt very, I was a struggling actor in New York, and everything felt very complicated and sort of overwhelming. And the simplicity of all I have to do right now is learn how to walk again was, yeah, freeing. It was a relief in some ways. And so it was before I'd really gotten involved in improv. What I know now is there's an improv principle in there, which is just the next one thing. And I try to remember that for myself when I feel overwhelmed or when things are getting really hard, which is, what is just the next one thing I can do that will move in a direction towards what I believe in or value or want?
I love that, and I think that even though deep inside we know we need that reminder every now and then, that it just focus on the step ahead. Don't and I'm trying to tell myself every single day, because I tend to get ahead of myself. I try to see 5 steps ahead, 10 steps ahead, 20, and then it's like I don't even know how I'm gonna get there. But instead of focusing on the next step, that's it, and we can avoid a lot of anxiety by just
I think so.
applying that principle.
Doesn't mean we don't want to have a great big vision, doesn't mean we don't want to have a North Star. But for most of the time, right? Like, what is just the next one thing? Because if there's anything that we know from improv that we now know in the world too, is we have no idea what's happening tomorrow. We have no idea what's happening a moment from now, really. So yeah.
True. Okay,
Beautiful.
Love that answer. Where can people find if they want to work with you or keep up with your work or hire you? Anything?
Yeah. So there are two parts of our business. We have an improv theater company that does improv workshops and storytelling shows and all of that. That's at mopco.org, mopco.org. And the consultancy, which uses applied improv and storytelling to help individuals and groups expand their performance range off the stage. And that's Koppett, just my last name, Koppett.com.
Awesome. Yes, I'll add those to the video, YouTube description, and show notes. Once again, Kat, was a pleasure having you on, and I had such a wonderful time talking to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I really enjoyed it as well.